So you've heard tale after tale, story after story, account after account of people reporting sexual harassment from people around folks you may admire or have heard terrible things about in the past in Hollywood. George Takei is the latest to be one of the people involved in one of those accounts. George Takei is Mr. Sulu from back in the day on Star Trek. You might know him more recently because of the "oh my" meme. And he is also an LGBT juggernaut when it comes to being a figure in that community and representing the LGBTQ community in whatever is happening in the news. So someone came out and said that 36 years ago in the actor's home, George Takei sexually assaulted him, took part in sexual misconduct. And George Takei came back to the claims from Scott R. Brunton saying, "Those that know me understand that non-consensual acts are so antithetical to my values and my practices. The very idea that someone would accuse me of this is quite personally painful." This, however, I don't know how well it jibes with what he said to Howard Stern, because there has been an interview that surfaced recently during which Stern asked, "Did you ever grab anyone by the cock against their will?" And Takei said back, "Some people that are kind of skittish or maybe afraid, and you're trying to persuade," Takei said. And then Takei later said that those incidents never occurred on the job, and that in his eyes they were consensual. Then it said, "No, I wasn't at work," he said. "It was either in my home, they came to my home." Stern then tried to get Takei to clarify further, asking if he'd ever gave someone a, quote, "gentle squeeze on the balls." And then Takei replied, "More than a gentle, but it didn't involve power over the other." So what do you guys think about this? What goes through your head when you hear something like George Takei, beloved LGBTQ icon, is accused of sexual assault?
Well, first of all, the interview, I don't know if you guys actually listened to the audio, but it's really disturbing. When Howard Stern asked him just a clear question, did you do this? Silence, just complete silence. It's really disturbing. And then as you said, Brett, he goes on to say, well, it was in my home. Like it wasn't at work. It was more than a gentle squeeze, and there wasn't any power involved. But I think that also highlights part of this that people who are in a position of power that are doing these things don't understand, is that even if you don't think you have power over somebody, he did. Even if you're just older than somebody, or if you are a boss, or somebody above them in any way, that adds a power element to it. And also, I think it highlights another point that sometimes people don't understand what is consent and what is not. Even if somebody did go to his house and he thought that meant that person, was wanting to engage in these kind of activities, that's not a yes, that's not consent. So it's really disturbing, and it just shows that it can be anybody. Anybody can partake in this type of thing and not really understand.
So what is consent though? Because when I read this, I thought, yes, George Takei back 36 years ago was young, Hollywood, successful, one of only probably 2 or 3 Asians on television. He was definitely a standout back then. So I'm sure he had some romps, with younger people that were in the industry as well. But you say consent, I always think, well, what is consent? Would consent be the person saying, yes, I want to? Or because even now, there is like body language and the conversation and innuendo, especially with, I guess, because being a gay male, I've been in situations with people that have for sure power over me in my career. When I first came to LA, I had a situation where I was dating an older man and he had the potential to give me what I wanted career-wise, and was for about a month or so we hung out, and there was times where he didn't come out and say he wanted anything physical, but I knew that was an insinuation, that he was insinuating that, and by me showing up, was that me saying, was I consenting to that? I think, yeah, I was, because I was there, but that's just in my situation. So back to my question, like, what is consent? Is it someone saying, yes, I want to have?
Consent doesn't necessarily need to be verbal. There are definitely like body language cues that can indicate that someone has given you consent. I'm sure that I don't necessarily have verbal consent from my fiance every single time I kiss her, but there is a agreement, a body language cue from her, that she reciprocates that. The important thing to remember about consent is that it can be rescinded at any point in time. You can be like, yes, yes, yes to like making out, going home with someone, taking off your clothes, and then at any point in time, if someone says, no, stop, that is the line with consent. That's the important boundary to remember. I know that it can seem like consent is a blurry line, but in fact, I think it's actually pretty clear. When someone says no, when they are pushing away from you, when they are giving you those bodily clues, that is when you stop. That is the line that you cannot cross. But when it comes to a consent as far as I want this action to, occur, then you have to just go off your own sensibilities. But the boundary to remember is that when consent has been rescinded, it is gone. It's like, it's not, you don't convince them. It's not like, but, please, but. Or what you hear in the account from this man who's come forward is that George Takei was like, relax, or no, it doesn't happen. Once the person says no, stop, get pushing away, then you stop, that's the boundary.
And I think most people, and I agree with you, Grace, I think most people, no is no. When you're right, it can be rescinded at any time. I'm saying there's some accounts of there's accusations where people actually did engage and then they said they didn't give consent, but it's like, how does one say what is consent and what is not consent, at least for me?
So if someone is intoxicated, then they are not legally able to give consent. So that's another thing to remember. So maybe someone is.
But what if you're both drunk?
That's a very good point. I mean, that's why it's important to have these conversations. So if you're both drunk, I don't know. I'm not a consent expert. I'm just saying like what
you're saying makes sense.
What I have heard, and then but what to remember is like if one person is not intoxicated and you are going home with someone who is very intoxicated, then you need to be really careful about the line of consent.
Right. Don't do that.
Do not.
Take someone home, and if they're too drunk, just make sure they get to sleep safely and then leave.
I think that Amir had said something this morning that was really eye-opening. Like what was back 30 some years ago, things were a lot different. It's not an excuse, but people's thoughts on hooking up culture. Because with Grindr and stuff, like you go to someone's house, you meet up with people, you automatically have that agreement that, hey, we're coming over to do this, or we're coming over to. So back then, what was the culture like? George Takei was an actor. I'm sure he was around people who probably men were physical beings like women, but we kind of think more with our little head than our big head. So I was thinking when I heard about George Takei, I thought, really him?
Well, he is also vehemently denied the allegations, and he has said that he doesn't remember this individual. And then he's also acknowledged that at this point it's still a he said. Now, for their part, the individual that has come forward, his story has been corroborated, or at least that he has told a number of other people who have backed up that they've heard this for a while. But that's where we're at as far as evidence right now.
Yeah, there's different levels of corroboration. It seems everyone goes toward, like there's the Dustin Hoffman accusation where there was a specific records and like the specific quotation of him saying, I would like a hard-boiled egg and a soft-boiled clitoris. That is something that adds to my believing of it. My default being like, why would you make something like that up? And this would only add to my belief in it. The idea of it being 40 years later is another element. It's literally 40 years later. And this is a difficult part of the conversation for me because it's all terrible. Anything, whether this is true or not, any act like this is in a category of terrible thing, right? We can all agree that sexual misconduct and assault is terrible. I always find myself comparing them to each other. And there's an implied scale that we just established of one person sober, the other person's drunk. That is super terrible. Comparing, saying if both people are drunk, well then if someone says no along the way, definitely it's a no. But 40 years ago, I feel like I can be upset with it 100%. I don't know, there's so much, there's also that thing that like, if he has done positive things in the community, I can still admire those things and be grateful that he has done those things and let the accomplishments he's made in those fields that field stand while still holding him responsible for the other aspect of it. And there's this muddiness that always gets into it where it's like, now do I have to completely throw everything George Takei did out with,
a lot of people
with this one act that we can point to 38 years ago?
But that's that muddiness, and where you're landing on that is how a lot of people actually feel about beloved. George Takei's beloved within our community, and because for Star Trekkies across the world love him to death. So it's like, but people don't want to say that though, because then it comes across as victim blaming. You're saying, you're saying that their accusation doesn't matter because this guy has done so much good since then. It's a very difficult part of the conversation to have. And then another person over the weekend, I was ear hustling. I do that a lot. I was ear hustling at Denny's, and yeah, when I had a Grand Slam breakfast, it was amazing. And this guy was saying like, I get why people don't come forward, but 30, 25 years later, it's like you come forward and it's destroying this person's career that they built that's taken them this long to build. It's just like, it's a no-win for, it's like, excuse me, sorry. What can you say?
Right, I think it's, and I might be wrong and I wanna know what everyone thinks about this and we have to leave it here, but I think it's still bad.
Yeah.
But there are things like mitigating circumstances. If he spent the last 30 years with his long-term, I don't know if they're married or boyfriend or whatever. If he hasn't done it in 30 years, it doesn't make the original act okay. But if he had gone to jail for 10 years, he would have been, if he had done something grievous, some sexual assault, he would have gone to jail and theoretically been rehabilitated, having paid his debt to society, so that we can move on from there. So I think if he's been spending 30 years not doing this, it doesn't make the original act okay, but it's better than if he had spent the last 30 years doing this. But even that, like, ethics math disturbs me to do. What do you guys think? Give us your thoughts. Thanks for watching the live stream. Check back throughout the week for more videos here on Pop Trigger.